On the evening of December 24, 2000, the police arrived at Susan Berman's rundown house on Benedict Canyon Road in Los Angeles. Her neighbors had noticed that her dogs were running free, something that Berman would never allow. When the police arrived, they found the front door unlocked and the back door open. They also discovered bloody paw prints leading to the back bedroom. Inside, they saw Susan lying dead on the floor, shot in the back of her head, execution style. She had been dead for at least 1 day. Upon inspection, the police found no forced entry and her purse untouched. Obviously, this was not a robbery gone wrong. But who would murder a down-on-her-luck writer? The police had some suspects. The investigators considered that it might be a mob hit. After all, Susan was the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster. They also had their eye on Susan's landlady and her business manager. But the main suspect on their list was the author of a note, one that had been sent to the police on the 23rd. The note had Susan's address along with the word cadaver written in big block letters. Who killed Susan Berman, and who wrote that note? Join us as we take a look at this case, as well as the various twists and turns, to find out what most likely happened. Who was Susan Berman? Susan Berman was born on May 18, 1945, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to a traveling dancer named Betty Ewald and Jewish-American mobster named David "Davy" Berman, the man who took over Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas after Bugsy Siegel's murder. Susan grew up in Las Vegas, where she considered the Flamingo Hotel as her second home, a place where her father helped her with her math homework using casino chips, where she was able to order shrimp cocktails to her heart's content, and where they held Passover seders. She adored her father, who she saw as the king of Vegas, while he treated her as his princess. On her 12th birthday, Davy even had Liberace sing happy birthday to her at a lavish party. Susan was living the high life, but everything came crashing down when Davy died of a heart attack during surgery just a month after her birthday. Just over a year later, Susan's mother, who had been institutionalized for depression, committed. As their only child, Susan inherited some of Davy's fortune, which was placed in a trust fund. She lived with her father's brother, Charles "Chicky" Berman, and his family in Lewiston, Idaho. It was there where she met her junior high English teacher, Dick Riggs, who inspired her to become a journalist. Years later, while studying sociology in UCLA, she met her most special friend, Robert "Bob" Durst, who is currently a graduate student in economics. The two formed a deep bond that lasted throughout the years. After graduation, Susan started writing for the San Francisco Examiner, covering the courts. In 1975, she put herself on the map when she published a cover story in City magazine titled, "In San Francisco, City of Sin, Why I Can't Get Laid." The following year, she published a comic novel called Driver, Give a Soldier a Lift. After getting noticed for her recent work, Susan eventually moved to New York, where she became a writer for New York Magazine, Cosmopolitan, and Us and Family Circle. She lived a lavish lifestyle, often entertaining fellow journalists and celebrities in high-end restaurants. While busy with work and friends, Susan would still find the time to write a memoir, one that focused on her much-adored father and her growing years in Las Vegas. The book, which was called Easy Street, The True Story of a Mob Family, was a success. Not long after, news about Bob Durst's wife popped up. Kathy Durst had vanished on the evening of January 31st, 1982. Many friends and family were aware of their tumultuous marriage, which was on the verge of divorce. Susan acted as Bob's unofficial representative to the media, driving the narrative that Kathy might have run off with another man. This caused the authorities to focus their investigation away from Durst. The case eventually turned cold. In 1983, Susan was living in LA and had embarked on a new career. Screenwriter. Easy Street's movie rights had been sold for around $350,000, and she was trying to develop the script. Susan had high hopes, but things didn't seem to be working out. Over the next decade, Susan had gotten married and divorced to Mr. Margulies, who later died of a drug overdose. She started writing scripts for a financial advisor, Paul Kaufman, who wanted to break into Hollywood. They weren't successful. Susan then wrote 2 romantic mysteries, became the lead writer for a 2-part 4-hour A&E documentary, Las Vegas, and wrote a companion book. Unfortunately, none of these were a success. Eventually, by the late 1990s, Susan was left in dire straits. She didn't have much money coming in. Her landlady wanted to evict her. Her friends would treat her to lunch instead of the other way around. In addition, she would eat ravenously whenever they did. In desperation, Susan reached out to her old friend Bob Durst. Because they had been out of touch for so long, she no longer had his phone number or address. She eventually was able to contact Durst, and he sent her a check for $25,000. It was enclosed in a letter postmarked March 3, 1999, that said, "Now and again I think about old times. Good luck, Bobby." Susan believed that her break was just around the corner. She had been working on several projects that she told her friends seemed promising. She was even hired to develop a story with veteran television writer Carol Mendelsohn for a CBS show based on a family that ran an off-strip casino in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, none of her projects, including the CBS show, came to fruition. By November 2000, Susan found herself still struggling with money. So she once again reached out to Bob. He sent her a second check for the same amount, which was dated November 9th. Just 2 days after, news broke out stating that the investigation on Kathy Durst's disappearance had been reopened by New York State Police investigator Joe Becerra. He was planning to interview all the people involved back then. According to Durst, Susan had told him that LA detectives had reached out to her, wanting to talk to her about Kathy. By Christmas Eve, Susan was dead. Because of the way that Susan was murdered, it was inevitable that many would think that she was killed by the mob. She was, after all, the daughter of Davy Berman. Though they might be viewed as decrepit gangsters by then, these were men who had transformed the former sleepy town of Las Vegas into a mecca for those who want to gamble and seek entertainment. Moreover, it was reported that Susan had always been suspicious of her mother's suicide for years, and she was supposedly in the process of investigating it at the time of her death. She even mentioned to her close friend, actress Kim Langford, that she had information that was going to blow the top off things just a few days before she died. Did Susan find out something so big that she had to be silenced? As fascinating as it sounded, there was really no evidence that supported this theory. The next suspect on the list was Susan's landlady, Delia D. Baskin Schiffer, who had wanted to evict Susan for quite some time. Susan claimed that Schiffer had once threatened her with a gun due to her overdue rent. According to her friends, Schiffer would often show up unannounced, and the two would fight about back rent, her dogs, and repairs on the house. Susan told her friends that she feared Schiffer would eventually harm her precious dogs. However, this 3-year eviction battle was reportedly about to end. Susan had borrowed money from her friend Bobby Durst and used it to settle her debt to Schiffer. She had paid up to March and had her lawyer set up an agreement that she would leave the house by June. Because of this, the theory that her gun-toting landlady had killed her was shut down. What about her manager, Niall Brenner? Because Susan hadn't produced anything noteworthy in several years, Brenner acted more of an errand boy than a manager by this time. In addition, Susan owed Brenner thousands of dollars. More importantly, Brenner was caught breaking into Susan's house after her murder while it was still sealed. There was also some speculation that he had written the anonymous cadaver note. A handwriting expert claimed that it was highly probable based on a comparison made between a sample of Brenner's handwriting and the note. During Brenner's police interview, he stated that Susan was a person who pushed people to the edge. He also admitted that it was very difficult to be with her. Because of their suspicions, the police had Brenner take a polygraph test, which he failed. However, owing to a lack of concrete evidence tying him to the murder, Brenner was never officially charged. The cloud of suspicion followed Brenner until someone else was charged with Susan's murder. Bob Durst, Susan's best friend. When the investigation turned to Bob, many of his and Susan's friends recoiled at the idea. They didn't believe that Bob would ever do anything to harm Susan, including Susan's unofficial adopted son, Sarab Kaufman. Despite their suspicions, the police couldn't find any clues, including to who the author of the cadaver note was. Eventually, Susan's murder became a cold case. In 2015, the filmmakers of The Jinx brought in new evidence to the authorities. They had found a letter that Durst had written to Susan previously, which showed the same handwriting as the one from the cadaver note. More importantly, both the letter and the note had the same misspelling of Beverly, spelled as Beverley. They also had video of Bob confessing to murder. Just a day before the airing of the documentary's final episode, Durst was arrested in New Orleans. He was charged with Susan's murder. In 2021, Bob was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Susan Berman. While there is already a conclusion to this case, we won't be taking it at face value. We'll piece together the evidence to see if we can find out what most likely happened. Was Bob truly guilty of Susan's murder? How did he do it? And why did he kill one of his best friends who had been loyal to him for decades? The authorities suspected that Bob had killed Susan because she was going to talk to the police about Kathy's disappearance. A friend of Susan's, Hollywood producer Linda Obst, said that Susan had told her that she had helped Bob cover up his wife's disappearance. The authorities believed that this was referring to the call made to Kathy's school asking for leave on February 1st, 1982. The caller was actually Susan. Aside from making the call, Susan also acted as Bob's unofficial spokesperson after Kathy disappeared, so there's no question that Susan knew something. During the trial, there were plenty of twists and turns as Bob's defense team tried to have some of the evidence dismissed, including the unedited videos made by the documentary's filmmakers. One of the videos contained Bob's voice declaring that he
What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
While shocking, the statement cannot be used as the sole piece of evidence of Bob's guilt. There needs to be other clues that show he had committed the crime. One thing that needed to be determined was whether Bob had the opportunity to kill Susan. It was discovered that he had been in California, specifically in San Francisco that December. But no one could place him in LA, let alone Susan's home. Some of Susan's friends claimed that she had told them Bob was going to visit her during the holidays that year, but there wasn't any evidence to support this, until Emily Altman was asked to testify in the trial. Emily Altman is the wife of Bob's oldest friend, Stuart Altman. They were all close friends, firm in their belief that Bob was not guilty. However, she testified in court that she knew Bob was in LA at the time. This reveal not only shocked the courtroom, but it also caused another twist in the story. Bob suddenly admitted that he had lied. He was in LA when Susan was murdered. More importantly, he was in her home at the time. He also stated that he saw her dead body, but he didn't murder her. But why didn't he call the police? Well, he claims he sort of did. Instead of phoning them, he sent them a note. Yes, Bob was finally admitting that he was the one who wrote the cadaver note. In an interview on The Jinx, as well as on an interview with the FBI, Bob stated that whoever wrote the cadaver note was the killer. Now he was admitting that he was the writer, but not the killer. He just wanted Susan to be found, but he was afraid of looking suspicious. As for why Bob was in LA, he testified that he was going on a staycation, planning to visit Susan and see some of the tourist sites in the area. If that were true, why had he taken an oddly circuitous route to Los Angeles, as if he was trying to cover his tracks? The last nail in the coffin was when Susan and Bob's mutual best friend, Nick Chavin, testified that Bob had confessed to him about murdering Susan in 2014. The words Bob said were, "I had to. It was her or me. I had no choice." Surprisingly, Susan had told Chavin that Bob had murdered his wife years before. He just didn't believe it because he didn't think Bob was capable of violence, which he was, and Susan was a storyteller. So how did Bob do it? Here's what we think most likely happened. Once Bob learned that Susan might talk to the investigators about Kathy's disappearance, he knew she had to go. She was struggling financially. She had already borrowed $50,000 from him. If he let her, she might use what she knew as a bargaining chip for more money. Getting a gun wasn't an issue for Bob. When they caught him on the run for the Galveston murder of Morris Black, the police found guns in his car. To make sure he couldn't be tied to LA at the time of the murder, Bob flew to San Francisco first, then to Eureka, California. From there, he went to his house in Trinidad to get his Ford Explorer. He drove south to LA on December 20th. He arrived at Susan's home sometime on the 23rd. She opened the door to him, something she only did for the people she knew who were coming to her house. Susan might have been showing him the back bedroom where Bob was supposed to stay. With her back towards him, Bob pulled out a gun and shot her in the head. Then he wrote a note to the police and walked out of the house through the back door. He dropped off the note in a Marina del Rey mailbox. And then he drove back again, flying out of San Francisco on Christmas Eve. It was a grueling 1,000-mile journey, but it had to be done. Where is Bob Durst now? After his conviction and sentencing, Bob was charged with the murder of his wife, Kathy. Unfortunately, before he could be put on trial, Bob died at the San Joaquin General Hospital while in the custody of the California Department of Corrections. He was 78. If you love our content and want to support the channel, feel free to check our web shop where you can find exclusive true crime merch brought to you by Bad Things.